Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Thank you for being here today. My name is Abhijit Bhaduri. I work with individuals and organizations to help them craft their career strategy and their branding strategy. Now, sometimes people ask me, what does a talent management person have to do with branding? You see, talent needs the greatest amount of branding. For example, you might be the best at what you do, but if nobody knows about what you do, people don't know where to find you. So branding becomes important for everyone. But today I want to talk to you about a very special guest of mine who I had the chance to work along with when I was on the board of MICA, which is a school dedicated to design, communication, and creativity. It's a very, very unique school. And I had a chance to talk to my guest for the first time when she was leading that institution as the dean. But this is not the only role that she's played. Today, my guest, Dr. Preeti Shroff-Mehta, is also looking after executive education as the director of education director at Mellon School in Northwestern. And prior to this, she has spent a very, very long time, almost 15 years, working with different government agencies like the World Bank, USAID, and of course, she has been teaching at Johns Hopkins University of Maryland. And so without any further ado, let's get started on today's conversation. Thank you for joining in. Thank you. Thank you, Preeti. Thank you so much for being here. And such a delight to have you on my show.
Hello, Abhijit. Lovely to be here.
So, Preeti, you've had the opportunity to actually travel across, how would I say, 30 countries? Is that an accurate number?
At least, yes.
What took you to so many countries, and what are some of the things that happened to you, which is what we want to talk about? But I want to begin by first asking you about your childhood. Where did you grow up?
So, Abhijit, we are both from India, but from different states. That means we can converse only in English. We have different mother tongue, right? That's the unique aspect of India. My family is from Mumbai, but I grew up in Ahmedabad because my father was a Gandhian scholar. And when they were building Gandhi's first institute in Gujarat, in a city called Ahmedabad, he was brought from Mumbai to Ahmedabad to set up the institute as the director. So I was very privileged growing up to be in this Gandhian ecosystem. And you asked about the childhood. My father would invite people from all over the world who would come to visit this first Gandhian education institution. And every evening, I remember from my earliest days of my childhood, we had people coming from all over the world at home for dinner to understand a Gujarati family and the culture, food, music, and they would interact with us. So I think I was given the United Nations sitting at home, and that was my DNA. I didn't even realize, but I was so comfortable engaging with folks from all over the world. And the other side of that coin was because it was a Gandhian institution, and they focused on self-reliance for village economy in India during the independence struggle. And he emphasized self-identity for a country. So we would also get so many different communities from all over India, including tribal communities and people from different states. So I was very privileged to have India 101 with its diversity in front of me as a little kid. And I would go share food from different people's plates and then listen to very serious and thoughtful conversations that my father would have with all these dignitaries coming from abroad or from all over India and people from village communities. And I can see their faces as I'm talking to you. So that was the privileged, I call it a gift that my father gave me. And my mother was Montessori educator and expert. So she worked with Sarabhai family. You would know who I'm talking about. They had an institution that focused on bringing children from different contexts and different cultures together, building on Rabindranath Tagore, who was a Nobel Prize winning poet from India, who talked about creating a nest where birds of different nature and different countries and different skies would come together and sit in that nest. And I was privileged to have that amazing intercultural educational space that my mother was very committed to. So in that sense, my parents gave me the best classroom where world was our learning environment sitting at home.
Did you always want to be in education? And if somebody had asked the 8-year-old Preeti, what do you want to do when you grow up? What would your answer have been? And how did that answer change over time?
I remember very early on, if anybody asked me, they ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I remember every time I would say, I want to travel. I want to be a traveler. Because I was so fortunate to have people from different walks of life, different countries coming home. For me, then the curiosity was, when can I go to their homes and their countries and experience their cultures? So very early on, Abhijit, learning while traveling became my mantra. And then later on, that morphed into focusing on study abroad experiences. I was to have St. Xavier's College, where we had professors from all over the world who would come and teach. And they encouraged us to go to local communities and travel around the world to learn and understand a subject. And just to give you an example, my professor of economics, Father Franco, was from the Basque region of Spain. And he taught us economics. Very first day of class, I distinctly remember, he said, let's talk about the national planning for a country. So we looked at the books and gave him all the answers of how do you create a 5-year plan for a nation. What is the role of industry? What's the role of civil society, role of government? He said, fantastic. So after 1 hour, he said, now put these books aside. There are slum communities right outside our university. Let's take a walk. And then he took us on a walk where we saw poverty in front of us and interacted with kids and people who were manual laborers who had come from Rajasthan, from nearby states, so migrant laborers. And then after an hour with them, we came back and he said, okay, now tell me, what is your dream of an India, of the future? So this kind of very complex experiences that bring you out of your comfort zone became my learning principle, but also as a professor, when I decided to focus on education field, the way I teach, the way I create the pedagogy of learning. So I hope that answers your question about what drives you. And, we don't realize, Abhijit, but childhood memories and experiences are very powerful and they drive us in terms of our core DNA as we grow up and make choices. So one choice I always made very consciously, very early on, was to talk to people who were different than me, because that's what I was getting at home every day. So even in the classroom, I remember I would never sit in one place, even though we were assigned seats, and teacher would say, Preeti, you keep changing your place. And I would say, yes, I want to, because I want to interact with different kids. And, in India's classroom, Abhijit, we have kids from different states with very different linguistic and other backgrounds. So India also was a fantastic place to grow up and recognize the value of diversity.
When you finished your education, where did your first job take you?
So very interesting, dilemmas that we face as young people when we have to make choices. And I was a young woman, and given my father's inspiration for me, logically, it was the civil service in India. And Indian foreign services attracted me because I could see that this profession will take me to travel around the world, will take me to different parts of India. And as you know, the civil service examination is one of the toughest. So I started preparing in my third year of economics because I was keen that I wanted to appear for this examination. And one evening, after studying in the library, I was coming out of St. Xavier's main gate, and I saw this huge notice board where they said announcing a new postgraduate program in social entrepreneurship and management. And this is a long time ago. I never heard the term social entrepreneurship and social management. So I was quite struck by what is this all about. And then I saw that my professor of economics, he was the director of that new Center for Social Management and Program. So I was very curious. So next day I went up to him and I said, I just saw this notice. What is this all about? And he said that this program is designed based on the philosophy of Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator who focused a lot on post-colonial countries and what should be the focus of education, where you do have to develop the strong identity rather than just adopting the identity that was given to you during the colonial time. And he created something called the conscientization and transformative learning education model, where you do have to understand your past, recognize what was lost during the colonial times, revive it, and then redefine what education's goal should be. So I was quite intrigued by this entire philosophy of the program. So I said, okay, I understand the theory part, but how would you actually do this in teaching? So he said, well, we are going to take students from urban settings, with institutions starting with St. Xavier's College, and then put them in rural India for one full year. And the context will transform them. Then, of course, we'll teach them, but teaching will begin with experience first. So instead of teaching from books, whether management, economics, political science, philosophy, you will experience context and communities first. You will bring your experiences and then we'll process those experiences to understand how do you create employment? How do you bring livelihoods? What about women, right? What access they need? What are their experiences? I was sold just in that first conversation. And that's what I was seeking through IFS examination, the entrance examination, Abhijit. So I said, this is actually much more powerful because it's about experience first and then bringing all the theoretical and learning tools to learn about different subjects. So I asked him, how do I sign up for this? And he said, there's an entrance test. And he knew me because I was his student, and he smiled and said, I think you will do quite well. Take the test. And the test was very interesting because it was interdisciplinary. It wasn't just test for one particular skill set. So talking about Micah's left and right brain intersection for creativity, that was the model. So I took the test and they selected me. So then I joined after my economics for my master's program, the social management program for 2 years. First year was experiential learning, going to different village communities every week. And then we would come back as a group of students on a Friday and spend time with very well-trained behavioral scientists, economists, political scientists, philosophers together to help us process. So it was experiential learning 101. And it was tough, Abhijit. My first few weeks going from a fancy urban city life and context, even though I had the global experiences sitting at home, thanks to my parents, actually walking into a village and having that rural immersion was, I would say, it deconstructed me completely. That's what Derrida, the famous philosopher, would say. It was deconstruction of my knowledge systems, my value system, my belief system. And it was a lot of unlearning that happened before learning could begin, because I had a very different perspective about life and people and what India was like, and what challenges people were facing, what were their hopes and aspirations. So that village classroom essentially reshaped me in a very different kind of human being, with a lot more empathy, compassion, patience, and critical thinking.
As you were talking about it, I could visualize the impact of the Jesuit framework that you described, of really going to a particular place and being part of a community and sort of working through that. That, I think, is truly transformative, because especially for somebody like you and me who've actually been the beneficiaries of the privileged opportunities that we've had, when you look at that, until you actually travel and live in a community which is very, very different, at the diametrical opposite end of that social spectrum, there is no way you can understand what that life is all about, so
the intensity of that learning. And you have to imagine, I was a young woman in a very traditional caste village, so with all kinds of hierarchies and their own traditions, but it was a drought region, and there was a reason why we were sent, right, to some of this context. And as you and I know, more than 60% of people still live in rural settings in India. So majority India is still rural. And I remember going to this household where I was asked to go and live, and they offered me water in a glass, not a glass, but the metal small piece of glass, the way they had designed it. And I drank that glass of water. After you finish, you pour the rest of it because you don't want anyone to have your water. And there was this silence in the room. And I couldn't understand what had just happened. I knew something was not right. So then I asked the mother, because women talk to women in those setups. You don't go and talk to men, especially in your very first week. And I remember her name was Daniben. I said, Daniben, I know something happened when I gave you that glass of water. And she said, well, we walk 3 hours to get a pot of water. This is a drought region. So for us, the value of a glass of water is very, very precious. and we never ever drop water like that. And Abhijit, it shook me to the core that the value of one drop of water for me was I just poured it because I was used to running water. And here this woman in a more than 100 degrees sun every day would walk for 3 hours to get a pot of water and bring it back for the entire family. And here I was from an urban context. I just dropped that water. And the reason I'm giving you this example is that moment that shook me was critical because later in my work with the World Bank and other institutions, I chose to go and work with refugees to understand their context and their setup, and then focus on economic development, especially of refugee children. I see the photograph. This is Shreyas Foundation in Ahmedabad, and it's an SOS village where they have destitute children who live on the campus of a school and interact with other kids who come. So that's a great example. Thanks for showing that moment.
This was just an incredible contrast. This is Dr. Preeti Shroff-Mehta that I am used to dealing with. And then you also sort of see this other side of your life. And it's just so incredible to get to know the person that you have become. When you look at privilege, it comes from so many dimensions. Talk to us about this particular photograph. What is this?
So this is MICA 101. You and I know MICA, the School of Ideas, very well. It differentiates its ecosystem and education system from other schools by emphasizing the intersections of learning that make us very uncomfortable. If you're an engineer, you learn mathematics engineering in a vertical, right? If you are in economics, you learn economics. If you're studying philosophy, these systems are designed as verticals, unfortunately. MICA demands that as an engineer, and more than 60% students who come to MICA to study management, marketing, creativity, design, as you said, communications, they come from engineering or science background. Begin by teaching them creativity, and they love it. It's not easy, it's frightening, but they love to focus on creativity and communications. And that's the photographs where we have this cultural festival, you know all about it, where we create a broader ecosystem beyond your subject classroom and invite industry folks, invite experts from different fields, people from rural setup who come and talk about, and especially alumni who talk about different experiences in their workplaces, different industries that they represent. So that's why that festival and Evolve is my very favorite and much important photograph that guides me when I talk about MICA. So thanks for showing that.
We'll come to talk a little bit more about this particular book. There are other photographs also. Tell us about these photographs, which are there.
This is the book that will come out in August, on August 8th. Rutledge, Taylor and Francis Group, they will publish the book. And Abhijit, you have contributed a phenomenal chapter on grief management. And I do want to talk about that. So please make sure we come to that, because I think I focus on institutions, capacity development, and grief is such an important aspect for students, for staff, for faculty. So this book focuses on post-COVID world, and question that we ask in the book is, how do we govern institutions? How do we govern companies, education institutions, societies? How do we govern self and people? So that's the book all about. And the 3 photographs that I gave you with the book are 3 institutions that I am connected with very deeply, where I love my lessons, academic and real life and practical lessons about strengthening institutions and investing in people. Because at the end of the day, institutions represent a set of people. And you know this better than me. And that's why it was a privilege, Abhijit, to work with you to nurture MICA. And as you know, my ambition for MICA was, given that it is already a very strong institution, my ambition coming in as the dean was to make it global in every sense of the word. So bring the world to MICA and bring MICA to the world.
What makes an educational institution global, besides, of course, the partnerships? When would you say an institution really goes global? What is that definition in your mind?
I think 3 things. One is the mindset, because our way of thinking is also, it guides our way of being. So I think the first part is, what is our thinking universe? when professors design a course, because universities deliver education through courses and subjects and departments. What is the thinking of that department? So let's say it's marketing or digital transformation department. How do you define that? Who influenced your thinking? What kind of books are you reading? Who do you interact with? So that's where partnerships come in. So first is the mindset of an institution that's reflected in its mission, its vision, and then all the other activities that follow. Second is institutional collaborations that influence the curriculum. So you talked about partnerships. So from country-specific partnerships to people-specific partnerships, because I believe at USAID and World Bank, we always talked about not just country-to-country diplomacy, but people-to-people diplomacy. So how do you bring professors together? How do you bring industry and academia together? How do you bring students from different parts of the world together? When I say partnership, that's what I mean. So that's the second piece. And the third piece, Abhijit, I learned coming back to India after, I think I returned to India to work full-time after 22 years. So it was a great journey where people thought I am an Indian, but I wasn't in many ways because I had lived abroad and I was an outsider. So I had to have that humility. But I realized that in India, we need to build capacity of institutions by strengthening policies with clarity. So it becomes a very clear map of guiding principles so that there is transparency. And it's not person-centric management, but system-centric management, which United States does quite well. You and I know that. But systems are designed and they are followed. So policies and structures. So once you have policies, how do you implement them? Then you need very clear structures with clear roles, clear expectations, and then assessments. And you know, being an HR guru, how do you define those expectations of an institution? They are communicated through policies. So I think those are the three things I would say. The mindset of an institution reflected in the culture and collaborations, and then in structure and policies. And when you can say that in all these three dimensions, we are global, the way we think and the way we operate. And obviously, I want to clarify, when I say global, I'm not saying India should go abroad and Indians should go abroad. For me, world should also come to India's doorstep. So while in India, I was very clear, it's a two-way process and two-way partnership and not one way.
I was just reflecting on your journey from what you described in your childhood, then to, this actually working abroad for many years and then coming back and working full-time, living in Ahmedabad, which is when we got a chance to work together. In some sense, what comes across very clearly is the sort of, in some sense, boundaryless perspective towards the world around you. So you draw from the world outside and contribute to the world outside. It's a seamless process. So it doesn't become that, you're only sort of receiving from outside, you're also contributing outside. And in both cases, it is done with no barriers. And in some sense, education must have the ability to think beyond disciplines. And I think that's one of the first opportunities I see in the world that we are entering now. I think that is going to be one of the big takeaways. And for those who have just started watching us, I am talking to Dr. Preeti Shroff-Mehta, who is leading the exec education program at Medical School of Northwestern University. And we've been really discussing her journey in terms of what she has seen to be a global, perspective in education. And I want to go back to sort of really doing a deep dive on that particular aspect. When you look at right now, as you think about executive education, as you look at education, we are living in a time where content has become commoditized. Any book that you want to summarize, I can just ask for it. OpenAI is going to give me that answer. So you can sort of really look at that. Is the value of the 4-year degree or 3-year degree, depending on which country you are in, is that still relevant? And if so, what's the reason why you believe that to be true or false?
Abhijit, we have discussed this many, many times. Institutions cannot be relevant if they are not ready to change, period. People who govern those institutions, they also have to change. And that's a tough proposition because these are institutions, especially in the US, they are legacy institutions and people from all over the world come, so they're massive as well. So one is the size of these institutions, and it's not easy to change the direction of the ship. It's going to take some time, but there is no choice. We'll have to. And whatever it takes, whether it's leadership that is going to give that direction, whether it's the ecosystem and the learners or clients or customers, as we say in the industry, they will push for it, or it's the educators themselves who are very aware of all the opportunities with the digitally driven or AI world and the constraints it's bringing and the speed at which we need to change. And obviously, change is never easy. We study this as our profession. Change is difficult, but there is no option. So what I would say is institutions are going to find it very difficult to change. But if we prepare ourselves and if we are ready to be courageous and say, let's take on this change process, which I think in different ways it's happening across institutions. There is no one uniform approach. I was just reading today that even for industry, when we talk about AI, it's not a standardized template or format. Each industry and within each industry subsectors, whether tourism or fashion industry, right, or technology, they all have their own nuances. So we need to actually now, instead of just saying AI revolution, we need to start looking at these verticals and say how they are going to adapt and learn from those different subsectors of industry. Same applies to university system. Institutions in India, within that different schools, institutions in America, in Africa, there is a process and journey. But I'm hopeful. What is at the core of coming to a university, Abhijit? You asked me about 3 to 5 year programs, right? It is not just going and sitting in a classroom. It's the beauty of a community that university attracts. So beauty of group of faculty members, staff on campus, other students, right? Your cohort that now comes from all over the world. That's the value of a university setup, that you have the opportunity to connect and network with this very diverse content that comes from very different parts of the world. So when we talk about university, let's also understand the ecosystem that a university brings.
When you look at transformation, in my view, one of the biggest challenges that happens is, the general belief is that in the university system, the students come there to get transformed, which is true. Every degree that I think of, the process of going through that learning process, no matter however much you try, I think that's the magic of education, that it does transform you. You start to think differently, you behave differently, and your view of the world changes. But I sometimes think that every year there is a different group of students who comes in and goes out. The institution sometimes becomes really like a cup holder. The water changes, but the cup doesn't change. And sometimes these are frameworks in many countries which, goes back even before the birth of the country. There are so many institutions of education which have been 200, 400 years old, 700 years old. It's hard for those institutions to change because, the people who are right there at the leading edge find it hardest to give up. My belief is we will see this configuration change. In some sense, what you see happening more visibly in industry, every year when you look at the Fortune 500 list, we actually begin to see that the top 10 every year is different. And if you go back 5 years, 10 years, you'll barely see 1 or 2 companies out there. I think it's a similar kind of a thing that is going to happen, but probably institutions have so far resisted all this shift until now. What do you think is going to happen with AI? How is it going to change higher education?
I think in many ways, but I'll focus on 2. One is the learners are changing and the way they learn, it's changing, Abhijit. So institutions can no longer expect that we have all the knowledge and we impart that knowledge and others come and learn, because when I am in a classroom, I'm fully aware that those who come to learn, they actually know the subject probably even better than me. So what is the value of that learning that I have to create in that classroom? So what is the definition of a classroom? So in that sense, universities don't have a choice because the customers and the clients, the students are going to demand different kind of learning experiences, and there is competition. If you can't provide, others will. And so in that sense, universities have to recognize the real threat. So that is one. But the second is also the exciting part of AI, Abhijit, where now can we create an intersection between AI and human learning experiences? And yesterday I was listening to your conversation where your speaker talked about, instead of transactional approach to AI, we need to have more collaborative approach where we work with AI to get best And I think that is the approach. And there is no doubt. I was just reading an article today that we all have to understand what this AI world is and what skills will be required for us to survive, because it is about educators' survival. Abhijit, I don't know, tomorrow you will be talking to my AI avatar. It's a possibility. You don't even need me. I remember visiting China with a group of faculty members from MICA, and this was at least 8 years ago. We were in China and they took us to this second largest telecom company that was working with the government to create education technology. So we were very curious. So we sat down and they said, here we will show you some innovations in our rural schools and urban schools. So they showed us a classroom and a teacher was standing there with all kinds of amazing techniques and tools and data sets it was a male teacher, was using. And so we were really very intrigued by it. And after 10 minutes of demo, Abhijit, the teacher just melted. And it occurred to us, this was an AI created teacher. So they had already, this is years ago, had created, the same teacher could teach in multiple schools at the same time, in the same moment. And I was blown away. And they were using this for giving access to rural kids in rural schools, access to the best educator. So just an example of how AI can create incredible access in education. In medicine, we know in a remote way, doctors can operate with minimally invasive procedures and do all kinds of surgeries. So I'm very hopeful about how we can utilize AI to create access. What I'm very mindful about, Abhijit, the other side of the coin, is privacy issues, where now AI is created based on data. And everybody talks about big data and large data and small data. My question is, where's the data coming from? We need to be very, very careful. Don't assume that you have a right to data or right to collecting data, because it's about human beings.
That is a choice. That even the user needs to be educated to sort of really say that, for example, when we say yes to cookies, you do not have to do that. You can reject all the cookies, but you kind of say that, what's the big deal? One more company will get to know that I prefer XYZ. But we don't realize how much of yourself you're giving away. It's really like, I was just trying to explain some time back to a family member, an elderly family member. And every time you say yes to this, today I know your name, tomorrow I know your address, day after tomorrow I know your bank account details. The next day I know about your family members and I get to know their details. How do you call them by their name? You have very little privacy left after that. And for the human beings to actually operate, there has to be a commonly accepted framework of ethics that I think needs to be brought across.
And that's why the book, Abhijit, we were talking about, The Global Governance in a Digital World, is the project I took on even before COVID happened, because we were becoming fully aware that we do need to have common frameworks, guiding principles. How do you educate stakeholders? Because we deal with multiple stakeholders, internal and external. Countries are at a very different stages of growth and development. So then how do you protect people who might not have the ability to protect themselves? There could be hackers and scams. So we do need to be vigilant and educated, as you said. We do have to make sure that we educate ourselves. And universities are definitely introducing so many more courses now across all disciplines in data governance, data analytics, narratives and data, ethics. So I hope that step by step, we will understand what world is unfolding in front of us. Abhijit, I don't think anyone knows what it's going to be. And as you always remind us, it's no longer, I get the degree and now I'm an expert for lifetime. Things are changing so rapidly. So one question I always ask myself and institutions where I work is, who is educating the educators? And who is the educator? That's a very important question. I hope universities will answer, because I think we need a cluster of educators and no longer one expert. We need person from industry, people who have studied the subject, alumni, people from other parts of the world. So I think university will have to start thinking in terms of a community of educators and not just specific subject-specific professors. And universities in executive education especially are looking at that model of hybrid. I would call it the hybrid learning culture and platforms.
Yeah, I would actually argue that Paulo Freire talked about and what you've experienced is that it's only when the decision maker walks outside of the glass wall, when you go out and work in the community, that you really begin to develop empathy. And I think in organizations as well as, educational institutions, one of the problems is that the decision makers very often tend to get isolated. The nature of the work is such that it doesn't give them time to live in the shoes of the customer. And I believe that there was a time when educational institutions were the only ones who had access to, let's say, a fabulous library or computers, and now, of course, in today's day and age, access to AI. But at the same time, we have forgotten that today your smartphone actually gives you access to all of this, which earlier was a privileged access. And therefore, the role of education, how we educate, what we educate, will need to change. Therefore, that it's not just the students who need to change and get transformed, but it's the educators who need to actually change much more.
Abhijit, as you mentioned rightly, immersive learning, however different institutions will define it, will become very critical. And as you know, at MICA, we introduced rural immersion, urban immersion, industry immersion, immersion with alumni. So different forms of immersive learning experiences are going to be very critical, because even in the digital world, at the end of the day, customer is a human being. So I'm trying to understand another human being, and I might use digital as a platform, but I need my emotional intelligence, empathy, my ability to decode the context. So, I always say the book is content is the king, right? It's a famous book. I think context is the queen.
Oh, absolutely. And I think content has become commoditized. So I'm not sure content is king anymore, because the role of the professor is actually only to bring in context, because content is commoditized. I mean, any particular subject that you can think of, you can get access to that, and it's free. So I really think that the model that universities have, they have to really question why somebody should, take on such a big loan. I mean, student loans in US are just at a different level.
Right.
It's just an unrealistic burden that every student who emerges from that actually carries. And it's really worth asking, what is it that you're providing which needs to have that kind of a payback, that, the job that if the cost of education does not get covered in, let us say, a year's salary, or at most maybe 1.5, 2 years salary, then it's overpriced. So if you're charging X rupees or X dollars, then you should be able to recover that in the salary of a year or 18 months. To me, that is the benchmark I would use, to describe the value. And the moment you do that, I just think so many institutions fall short, because there is administrative bloat. There is, we have built in 5-star institutions. So if the world of work is facing this return to office problem, because we've signed on lease of the building, so the only way to do that is to get everybody to come back and use the building. Is in the same way, the universities have really built in, 7 swimming pools which are heated, and so many classrooms, and these many fields, and this many this. A lot of that is a massive amount of burden which is placed. And this is exactly how, the cost of education becomes something out of reach for the average person. That, I think, is a tragedy.
Definitely. And Abhijit, there are huge issues, as you and I know, in terms of the financing of higher education, the burden it puts on parents, the lack of access it creates actually for a majority. So there are some fundamental issues with the way we are delivering education, and can it be so expensive? That itself is a fundamental question about the future of education. But the other point I do want to make is universities or places of learning, if we call it places of learning. I think in future, Abhijit, as digital learning will become more accessible through technology, the human experience will become the premium.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
No doubt about that.
So it's the collective experiences that universities, so I think universities will have to literally create communities that we are losing. Peter Drucker, the guru of management, and I remember reading his book years ago where he said that America's biggest loss will be the day we start losing communities and that fabric. And I think we're losing it. And kids are not getting that community learning the way you and I think growing up had that incredible experience or a set of experiences. So universities as places of learning will have to bring those very unique human experiences for an individual in a collective setup. That's one thing. But second point I want to make, Abhijit, just today I read the CEO of Nike talked about why innovation of Nike is not where it should be in the post-COVID era. And he said categorically that after COVID, people have not come back to work together as human beings in a physical space and context. And you can't innovate the most cutting edge shoe just by looking at computer screens in digital space. So it struck me that innovation also requires human connect and human creativity in a collective form. So in a digital world, and that's what the Nike CEO was talking about, that even in a digital world, we need people to come back to all. In his case, it's bringing folks back to the office. But innovation requires the human connect and human emotions. So let's not separate innovation from the human creativity aspect. So companies and institutions will have to invest in human ecosystems.
I also think that when you have event which shapes the entire world, just as the pandemic did, for about 2 years, we were all in a completely different thing. It was almost as if it was a break from previous history as we knew it. And, the world emerged very different. I think the pandemic changed everybody in a very fundamental way, almost at a DNA level, which is why in the book, when I talk about the whole notion of being able to understand grief, that was for the first time I began to experience grief, not just from the loss of a loved one, which I experienced during COVID, but I also think that there is so much of grief that happens around in all the places where we work, where we teach. There's grief in the universities, there's grief in the workplaces, which is triggered by the loss of something familiar. If you think about it, that's the real trigger for grief. Then in which case, I think there is so much that needs to be done. There's so much that needs to be done to be able to address those human emotions. But we cannot do it over a sort of a digital device. It is harder for people to experience that connectivity. It may be required. Yes, if I have to connect with somebody who is millions of miles away and I have to do it every week, it is harder from a cost point of view. But wherever possible, I would think that it is a loss to actually not meet people and work together in person. So this is the big shift. There is an efficiency element, productivity element, which I think AI will take care of. And I don't think we need humans for that. But there is a creativity element. There is a collaboration and community building process, which only humans can do. That, I think, can be done only in person.
That's what, Abhijit, we call emotional intelligence, right? That is not something that you can just do on screen. And I think what we need to be very, very conscious of in a digitally enabled world or AI-driven world is mental health issues are rising. Our kids who spend hours and hours on screen don't know how to have conversations with the parents. So families are struggling, correct? And as human beings, our source of happiness can never be the digital world. Our source of skills, yes, but we are people with emotions and we do need to figure out ways to coexist, to collaborate, have compassion to support each other. And as you look around the world, Abhijit, we are failing as human beings, right? There are wars. I never thought what I'm witnessing now, that in my lifetime, I will witness the kinds of wars and famines and conflicts that we are witnessing, where people are not able to respect each other's faiths and each other's diversity and differences. So, Abhijit, if we don't recognize the urgent need for us to connect as human beings, AI can't help us teach that. We can't blame it on AI. We need to learn it as human beings. So I think we also have a learning curve ahead of us, not to forget that there are issues in the human world that we will need to resolve.
When you look at the next couple of years, whichever way you define it, what would you want to be working on for yourself? How do you define growth for yourself?
Abhijit, I'll speak as a mother now because my joy is my daughter, Naomi. And when she was growing up, I realized how much it takes for us as a parent to understand a kid who is growing up in a very different world. What drives me now is that ability as a mother to nurture someone younger, but also as an educator, make sure that we can create the best learning ecosystem for this younger generation, because that's the best we can do, Abhijit. Their world is evolving faster than we can comprehend, and they have so many more complex realities that they'll have to face than what we face. So my commitment is to invest in learning for myself as an educator and invest in a community of educators, managers, leaders who will become the leaders of tomorrow and hopefully make the world a better place than where we are. I think that's the passion.
What is your routine of reading? How do you educate yourself?
I love reading, especially now, Abhijit. In between, I think we were so mesmerized by the digital world that we forgot the joy of sitting and reading a newspaper at 8 o'clock in the morning or reading a book in a quiet space and what it does to you, apart from comprehension that you learn and your writing and verbal skills, which are very much connected with your ability to read. So I think we are losing that skill. But so consciously, I remind myself that we all have to return to reading, because reading is also about reflection, right? It's that quiet time. I think we are very afraid of that quiet space because you have to face yourself. As you read, you reflect on things. So I actually make it a point to, in the morning, I actually listen to audiobooks. I'm finding audio very, very useful, Abhijit, because it's multitasking, right? We all have to do a million things. So I listen to a podcast or audio stuff in the morning. Then, fortunately, as part of my profession, I do have to read a lot. If I'm designing a course syllabus or a short-term course, I have to keep reading a lot. So I do have access to subject-specific reading. But then every evening now, for 30 minutes, I just read, even if it's a paragraph, literally read, meaning take a book, I want to show you. So this is the book I don't know if you can see it, but I'm
Yes, I can. Rewired. Yes, of course. Eric Lamar.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I don't have time to, in today's world, read the entire book. I don't have 4 days break where I just sit and read the book. I read a page just before going to bed. And then I just reflect on what are they saying? What are the implications? So I think reading is a tactic for me, but the reflection that comes out of that reading that challenges you, and then you apply that in your operational stuff. That part, which is very critical part of experiential learning also, processing what you are learning is very important for me.
What is one idea that you picked up from a book and implemented in your work?
I would say integration, whether it is integrating across silos and verticals. And I teach change management and circular economy and sustainability. And what's becoming very clear is that no one function can implement sustainability in a company or for a brand. It's not just marketeers. It's not just your finance people who tell you how sustainability is translating into growth and revenue and bottom line. It's not just legal folks who remind you what SEC is asking in terms of sustainability compliance. It's your leadership, it's the board. So what I'm learning is traditionally we designed institutions with these verticals and silos. Now we all have to learn to integrate. So it's cross-vertical integration is what I'm learning. That's going to be very critical.
It's almost time. I'm going to ask you to share your favorite books. If you had to give a recommendation of a couple of books, what would those be?
I'll try to do non-fiction because I don't have fiction. Non-fiction I do all the time. So I can suggest a range of books. But in terms of fiction, one book, Abhijit, and I mentioned this to you before, that touched me. There are things that touch you very deeply, is The Kite Runner. Mm-hmm. And partly because it's about Afghanistan, where it was. And we look at Afghanistan now, and it breaks my heart that in the 21st century, there is a country where the government, which is Taliban, they have made a policy that girls can't go to school. And I never thought in my lifetime I will see this. So in that sense, Afghanistan and understanding a boy's journey, a young boy's, because I'm a girl and a woman, but understanding a boy's world, it was so powerful to me. And the book is global in the sense the young boy travels and comes to America. So there were so many parallels about what happens to a country going from traditional to colonial times to modern times. And looking at the transformation of the world through a boy's struggle was phenomenal for me. So that book has impacted me very deeply.
With that, thank you so very much. And I've shared your LinkedIn profile. So I would absolutely recommend to everyone that do follow Preeti on LinkedIn. And, it's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with the listeners. Thank you once again for being here.